everyone, Scott Hansen here from NFL Red Zone. I hope you're checking out 1 hour of 5 Yard Rush, one of the best podcasts on NFL football in the UK.
Hello, Rush Nation, and welcome to the 5 Yard Dynasty podcast. I am your host, Liam, at the FSA Tweets on Twitter. And today I am joined to talk about the 2022 tight end season by Nathan, or at Nate the Saint FF on Twitter. He's a 5 Yard writer for both Dynasty, and he's done a few bits for the redraft. And I know that he's into his IDP as well, so he's probably done something there as well. But he's also a co-host at Across the Pond. That is the at Across the Pond RW podcast. So, Nate, how you doing? How you been?
Yeah, thanks, Liam. Been good. It's obviously been an exciting phase in the playoffs. Sorry, Liam, the echo is coming back. It's coming back really badly.
You go for it, or we'll try and figure it out.
But yeah, no, it's been the playoffs have been really good. So it'll be exciting to see the Super Bowl in 2 weeks.
Yeah, Super Bowl in 2 weeks, as you said. That was kind of nuts. We went through a long off season. Season went too quickly, but it's actually like a good portion of the year. It's about half the year of the playing season, so it's nuts that the Super Bowl is here. Do you have any plans in 2 weeks' time?
Nothing planned yet. Obviously, I've got a few friends in the local league. I obviously live in London, so we're going to try and meet up for the game. There are a few pubs that are offering sort of deals to show it a little bit later. But no, yeah, hopefully a few of us will get together and watch the game. It will be obviously a late night here in London, but it'll be good.
It will be, yeah. I saw that there's been a severe lack of Super Bowl parties posted on Twitter and on Facebook. So I hope that people have still found their ways around London and the surrounding areas all over the UK to find their Super Bowls. I've got plans with my dad and a few mates. We're just going to watch it over at one of their houses, just have a chilled out session rather than what I did last year, which is me and Chloe went down to London for the Warrior Bowl and 5 Yard Rush get together. So that was quite fun. But this year a little bit more chilled out and a lot more TGI snacks on the table, because you can get them from Ireland apparently. I've not tried them yet. Ready.
No, good. I think it's going to be a festive evening all around the world, or obviously especially in the UK and the US. But it's exciting. I'm rooting for the Eagles, and I hope Jalen Hurts can sort of tick a box. And that's nothing against the Chiefs. I like what the Eagles have done as a franchise.
Yeah, I'm completely with you. And my dad's an Eagles fan, so I'm sure he'd kill me if I didn't say I was rooting for the Eagles. But if the Packers aren't in it, then yeah, I'm an Eagles fan, unfortunately, for those listening. Nathan, as you know, we always go with a guest interview just to introduce you. I mean, we've already seen you on the podcast before, so it's not your debut, but how long have you been playing fantasy football?
Sure, Liam. So it's now, I would say, 5 full seasons. I sort of started in just a home league sort of redraft with sort of NFL.com and did that for 2 years. Then during sort of the COVID lockdown period, I think a lot of the world got really online and very sort of involved in Twitter and that sort of area. So I went from essentially 2 redraft leagues to suddenly about 10, 15 dynasty leagues, and then had to sort of bring it down again. And now, so I've controlled it down now to about, I would say, 8 leagues, of which it's sort of diversified. So we've got about 2 redraft and a few IDP, but yeah, for about 5 full seasons now. And yourself, Liam, you've obviously been a bit of more of a veteran.
I'm going to surprise you, and I'm not. You actually followed my career arc in fantasy pretty similarly. 5 years ago, I always know how far I'm in because I know Saquon Barkley. I took him in the second round because no one wanted to take him in his rookie year because no one knew what he was going to be like. And he and Alvin Kamara took me through to my rookie championship. So I'll always remember that. But yeah, it's quite interesting to know that you see me as a veteran, and yet I've been playing fantasy football for the same amount of time.
No,
And
I
what's
think
weird is
I'm in
Dynasty's
a
about the same
similar.
as well.
Yeah, I think I'm in a similar boat to you. I think you just assume people have been in it a long time, but it is quite
Yeah.
a in its infancy. I remember my first draft in the home league, and I think I had the 103 or the 104. And about 5-6 years ago, and Shady McCoy when he was with the Bills, thinking this was the thing,
Yeah.
and that turned out terribly, and I learned the hard way.
That's always the way, though. Nathan, you obviously produce fantasy football content for 5 Yard. You're a co-host for the Across the Pond podcast. How did you get into creating that content and gracing the Twitter landscape?
Yeah, so going back to sort of COVID lockdown, obviously a lot of us got involved in Twitter, and just I was more a consumer of content originally, and just sort of reading articles and working on my sort of knowledge. And then what happened was I sort of reached out to the 5 Yard Rush guys, and I loved what you guys were doing, the articles that you're putting together, and I just wanted to be involved in discussion really. And so then I sort of reached out to yourself, and I reached out to I think it was Rich Dynasty Island at a stage, and then fortunately there were just a few options, a few openings, and then I ended up obviously helping Rob on the redraft side of things with sort of a fantasy focus, looking at 3 or 4 matchups every week during the season from week 1 to week 17, and just sort of pinpointing sort of the pros and the cons and the offensive side and any sort of fantasy opportunities from week to week. But yeah, it's still really very much in its infancy, but it's something that I enjoy sort of sharing an opinion, but at the same time obviously consuming that content too.
I mean, we're glad that you've come along and joined us for the ride. I'm going to move over to the brain teaser that I ended last week's session on. So that was because we did the wide receiver breakdown. It is a wide receiver question. It was a lot easier than the previous ones. It is a name you probably have heard of more than once in a season. So I'm going to throw it over to you first, see whether you can give us the answer. If not, then I'll reveal it. But Nathan, which wide receiver did I have to exclude from the top 12 wide receivers in points per game because they didn't play enough games? And I'll give you a hint. The minimum was 4 games, sorry. So he played less than 4 games.
Michael Thomas, maybe?
But yeah, bang on. I hoped you got that because he was a Saint as well. But yeah, bang on. If you got Michael Thomas, that is your answer.
Yeah,
Go on, sorry.
No, yeah. Obviously, the seasons, as a Saints fan, the season started pretty optimistically, or maybe wishfully, I would say, opposed to optimistically. And obviously, he got off to a great start in the first 2-3 games, and then we never saw him again, which was a shame. But the excuse me, the silver lining from that is obviously Olave's sort of breakout. But yeah, shame about Thomas.
Yeah, I had Thomas in one league, and I tried to sell him for those first 3 weeks and couldn't get a bite, and that was a shame because I couldn't get anything else after him. He started in between Amon-Ra St. Brown and DeAndre Hopkins. If my memory serves me right, that puts him around wide receiver 9 in points per game. So there's your answer. And as usual, stay tuned to the end because I have a wide receiver tight end brain teaser this week. So let's move straight into the top 12 points per game. As usual, I use 4 games minimum, but luckily I didn't have to exclude anyone this week. Just Michael Thomas out of this entire series, which is quite interesting. So I use PPR, and I only used weeks 1 to 17 because, as I always say, week 18 is probably the week that you shouldn't be playing fantasy football in. Players sit all the time, and you'll probably get into the playoffs with, say, Josh Allen or someone along those lines, and they end up sitting because there's nothing to play for. Didn't happen this year across the board for a lot of players, but it does normally happen. Anyway, I'm going to go through the top 12 quickly, and then we'll recap. So 1 through 12 in this order. So you've got Travis Kelce, TJ Hawkinson, George Kittle, Mark Andrews, Dallas Goedert, and Zach Ertz, which a lot of you have probably just raised your eyebrows about, but he was really good for 10 games of this season until he got injured and went on IR. Then Evan Engram, Pat Fryermuth, Darren Waller. Again, a lot of eyebrows probably just went up. He played 8 games and he was the tight end 9 in points per game because he did so well during those 9 games. Or I say he did so well. He did well. David Njoku, tight end 10. Tyler Higbee, tight end 11. And Dalton Schultz, tight end 12. So there are a few there, Nathan, that played less than a season. But before we dive in, how many of these tight ends from the top 12 do you think had 16 games this season? So that's a full season.
So how many of the top 12 played 16 games?
Correct. Yeah.
Wow. I would
Putting you on the spot.
I would say maybe 2, and I'd be sort of. I'm pretty sure Kelce played the full season, and then I would have thought Fryermuth played quite a bit, but I'm not sure if it might just be 1, but I would say 2.
You got it right with 2, but you didn't get the 2 names. So you got Travis Kelce, he did play 16 games, and TJ Hawkinson still played 16 games, even though he was traded mid-season. So we may as well start there at Travis Kelce. We've already mentioned him multiple times. He's undoubtedly the tight end 1 for redraft. But I want to know where you have him in Dynasty at the moment, Nathan, because let's look at him as a whole. He's 33 years old currently, and he will be going into the season. He will be turning 34 during the 2023 season. He's the same age as when Gronk retired for the second time. Let's point that out. Gronk retired at 33 last season, so same age. And Tony Gonzalez, however, still was active for another 3 to 4 years when you put it onto Kelce's timeline. He was active to 37, 38. So what do you foresee for Travis Kelce? Because right now, if you could guarantee 3 years on Kelce's current career and trajectory, he's undoubtedly the tight end 1 in Dynasty. But because he's just got that surprise retirement kind of factor into it, I think everyone's kind of discounting him. He was DLF ADP in August was tight end 3. It's still tight end 3 even now, I believe. Yeah, it's still tight end 3. So where do you have him? Do you have him at tight end 3 and agree with consensus?
I still think you have him at tight end 1. I think I do hear you and the concerns with age, but I still feel his asset value and his floor is so high that you won't lose value. In my opinion, you won't lose value taking him 1, because should you go through half the season and you do find yourself in a dynasty league where your team is struggling and you might be in a position to look to go younger, he will still have that elite trade value. And I think any team that is pushing for a title, whether that is you at the time or whether that's one of your competitors in the league, Kelce will be an absolute trump card. So even though his age and those sort of that is the only question mark, his age and whether he's going to retire. Yeah. And I think as long as he's linked to Mahomes, I can't not have him at number 1 and just in his own level.
He's currently the oldest tight end being drafted by Dynasty players, according to DLF ADP, and that's by a whole year. The next youngest is a whole year younger than him. I'm frantically clicking buttons to find out who it is. So that's Zach Ertz, Taysom Hill, both 32, around the same year, same date of birth. Kelce. So he is old in terms of tight ends, but I think he's still in his prime. He's not slowing, or he's not showed signs of slowing down. I know that there is a bit of concern around his back going into the weekend games. So that is the championship weekend games. So maybe we do see a bit of slowing down from him, but I've got him as tight end 1. I can't not have him as tight end 1 while he's producing nearly 20 points per game on average, which is nuts.
Yeah, it's crazy. You can't compare, and I think the extreme barren land of the tight end position as well inflates his value even more, in the sense that look, if he was competing with the wide receivers, then by all means you could probably be looking to fade him. But because to me there aren't or there are no other tight ends in his bracket, in my opinion, in terms of production, in terms of consistency. There are obviously a few younger guys that we'll get to that are showing incredible promise, who could well have an argument to be higher than him in Dynasty, but at the same time they will have much bigger and many more question marks surrounding them, in my opinion.
Yeah, so let's move on to one of those younger tight ends. And when I say younger, I mean he's just younger than Travis Kelce, which is all of the tight ends. But TJ Hawkinson, tight end 2 on the year. That was both in points per game and season-long scoring, because he played all 16 games. The only other tight end other than Kelce to do so this season. What's interesting to me is that he was the tight end 2, even though he had a trade during the season. Between weeks 1 to 8, where he was on the Lions, he was the tight end 4 overall and in points per game. Weeks 9 to 17, where he was on the Minnesota Vikings, still tight end 2 for both during that time. So I think at the start of the season, you could quote me saying that TJ Hawkinson has the most talent and is the most likely from the rest of the tight ends to jump up into that elite tier that was then 5 tight ends, which was Kelce, Kittle, Pitts, Andrews, and Waller. And it looks like he's kind of made that jump. But do we expect him to stay like that? Noah Smith, who was there, got injured and probably prompted that trade go through. He is a free agent at the end of this year, so that's going to be Hawkinson's role going forward with the Vikings. So do you see him as this top elite tight end? Because I know ADP does right now.
I do tend to agree. I think a lot will sort of depend on what they do with that offense. I think obviously they had sort of the perfect storm, the Vikings, by the NFC North sort of stuttering a bit. Obviously the Packers had an off year, the Bears with the 101 pick, and the Lions obviously rallied really late. So the Vikings sort of cruise, and they're riding one of the best offensive players in the game with Justin Jefferson. So I think he is in a perfect situation where he's sort of the wide receiver 2 / third option here for Kirk Cousins. He's got a very accurate quarterback, although not razzle dazzle. He ticks the boxes and he gets the job done.
Yes.
It's a shame that the Vikings didn't turn up in sort of the wild card round against I think it was the Giants. But at the same time, I do like Hawkinson again for next year, or for this year now, 2023, going into next season, and I do think he'll keep his level. Whether he's still that elite tier, I think he's on the cusp. He is there with your Kittles and maybe and obviously your Pittses when he comes back from injury. But yeah, I think he's still clearly off the pace of Kelce, but he's definitely, I think he's got a solid ceiling.
I think that's the key thing with this is we've seen Kelce kind of take a step, well, not even take a step forward, but create a gap between him and everyone else. I mean, we've seen it over the years, and I think people were trying to put other players with Kelce, hoping that they'll get there, but I just don't think that's going to happen until Kelce slows down. I think we're kind of hoping that someone does, and maybe Kyle Pitts is that guy to do that in another year's time when he's got another year under his belt, and an actual quarterback that can throw in the ball accurately and have some sort of scheme around him, as well as Drake London there. But it's not Kyle Pitts' turn. It is CJ Hawkinson's turn. He is the tight end 4 in January ADP for DLF. He's only 25. He'll be turning 26 going into the next season, I believe. So he has all the hallmarks to be a reliable tight end option. And I think that the way that I'm doing my rankings now is Kelsey number 1 as a tier on his own, and then you've got the tier underneath, which is Andrews, and I'm even putting Hawkinson into that tier because he's proven to me now that he can be that level and he can be consistent at that level as well. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the big thing as well is that when you're thinking of a startup draft, especially in Dynasty, as opposed to sort of mid season or mid Dynasty through a couple of seasons, in the startup draft, I think we are going to start to see a huge transition to elevating the value of wide receivers. And I think because the wide receivers are tending to hit a lot more and becoming a lot more productive, I can see this second tier of tight ends sliding a little bit. And I think that's where you can possibly look to get value is you might be getting people taking obviously your Olaves and your Elijah Moores and some of these young, even your Jameson Williamses, they'll be thinking of these younger wide receivers when they're going to break out ahead of your tight end too. So if you do start sleeping on your Hawkinsons and your Kittles, I do think we might see their overall ADP sort of fall in drafts and startups.
yeah.
But I do still see their value in terms of the tight end position.
So the last guy that I really wanted to talk about in this top 12 is George Kittle, and that is the tight end 3. I didn't mean to go 1, 2, 3, but here we are. And this is just more for a warning than anything else. I mean, I don't know whether you're on my wavelength or not here, Nathan, but I just have this really weird feeling about George Kittle that I can't explain too much because the numbers don't fully back it up, but at the same time they kind of show an indication of that. I'm just worried about the QB position going forward. He was okay with Purdy there. He was also he'd also go quiet for games. He was much better with Purdy than he was with Jimmy G, but that could be said with the whole offense there. When he was with Lance, small sample size, there's only 5 games, but he did drop. He had the same amount of targets, but he ended up having 3.5 fantasy points less, and he was a 5 to 24 split games wise. So it's not a hugely small amount, but it's also not a big amount. That being said, I can understand why people want to buy in on Kittle. I just think that he's a sell at the moment, and I sold him for a late first in a Titan Premium League to a contender going for the playoffs. And I wasn't too worried about that. I was quite happy that I managed to get that. Where do you sit on George Kittle? How do you feel about him?
So just to use your example there, I think I would be a buyer in sort of the Kittle because I do hear all your concerns, and I think that's what you can use to leverage his price. And I think if you are in a situation in a dynasty league where your team is thinking about contending next year, maybe you're a piece or two away, I do think you can use the narrative of Lance, Purdy, maybe Tom Brady, who knows who's going to be standing under center at the start of the season for the 49ers. I think Kittle is a huge part in San Francisco. And I think even with all their weapons that surround him, your Ayuks, your Debos, your CMCs, your Elijah Mitchells, I still think Kittle is... sort of backtracking, I do agree with you. I'm thinking he's becoming a bit of a boom or bust, but I do think he still has. We will see him in the top 5 tight ends, if not top 3 tight ends next year, provided he stays fit. And that's why I do think if you are looking for a piece to maybe push you over the top, maybe the QB uncertainty might help you buy him at a discounted price. But at the same time, if you are in a more conservative position in your dynasty league, I would be wary of that QB position because, as you say, that could genuinely go either way.
Well, when I look at his split with Brock Purdy, it suddenly gets a lot better. So, for reference, he had 11 points per game, PPR points, that is, when he had Lance in for those 5 games. So, not a huge amount. But with Purdy, he has 17 PPR points. So, yes, there's a massive gap there. But do you foresee Purdy taking that job from Lance? I think that's the biggest question. If you see Purdy taking the job from Lance and you think Kittle's going to be the guy there, as in for tight ends, then he's a buy. But if he's not, and you kind of think Lance is going to be the takeover, and you don't think he's going to gel with Lance, he's a sell. He seems to be a polarizing guy, especially with his upside.
I think he's definitely a guy that if you're doing startups now, I think you do err on the side of slight precaution. But as soon as we do get more information on what will inevitably happen at the quarterback position, which again, I don't expect that to be anytime soon. That's going to be a sort of preseason battle. I wouldn't even be surprised if it's a full-on Purdy Lance fight to the death, or who knows, Kyle Shanahan might be fed up and say, let's just bring in a vet to tick this over because they got that far with Mr. Irrelevant. Surely, if it's anyone else, you win the whole thing next time. So. Yeah, I think keep a close eye on that San Francisco quarterback situation. But yeah, if you are doing startups now, I do agree with you that you just need to be a bit conservative with Kittle, and maybe there are some other better options out there that are cheap options as well in startups as well.
Yeah, so Sam has mentioned in the chat that Trey Lance will be starting at the end of next season. So I don't think he'll like your veteran take there, but I do think that that there's definitely a competition going to happen. Whoever ends up starting at the end of the season, I don't know. So Nathan, who in the top 12 that I've already mentioned, obviously, do you really want it? Did you really want to talk about? Is there a guy that really appealed to you that we've not spoken about so far?
So I'm gonna speak of a guy to sort of. I was incredibly impressed by him, and I think he sort of came from nowhere. But I think he's going to go back to nowhere, and that's Evan Ingram. I was obviously, I think everyone obviously when he was at the Giants, everyone was very hopeful for his production, and it was very sort of hit and miss. Obviously with Daniel Jones at the time, I think the Giants were just coached quite poorly, and they struggled to be very offensively effective, and they were very dependent on their wide receivers as opposed to their tight end. I think Ingram obviously turns up in Jacksonville, sort of clean slate. Let's see what it's like with this next prodigy quarterback, Trevor Lawrence, and something's clicked there. And it was more sort of, correct me if I'm wrong, closer towards the end of the season. I seem to remember that Evan Ingram sort of hits his strides. He sort of had that in, I think it was week 14 against the Titans. He had sort of 2 touchdowns. Week 13 against the Lions, he had his touchdown. So 4 of his touchdowns came from week 8 to the end of the season. So it was sort of the click. But in the same narrative here, what I will say is that Calvin Ridley, we mustn't forget he's coming back from a suspension next year for the Jacksonville Jags. And I think this target share, we mustn't get too overhyped on Evan Ingram because I don't think it will be sustainable when Ridley gets into town. That's just my opinion, really.
I mean, during those weeks, Evan Ingram was the tight end one, so that's between weeks 13 and 17. When you look at an average, he's still tight end one as points per game during that time. So I understand where you're coming from. You also said 4 of his touchdowns came from week 8 onwards, sorry. That was all of his touchdowns for the year. It was just 4. So I get where you're coming from. I was massively hyping up Ingram. He had a 4-game stretch earlier on in the season between weeks 5 to 8. He had a good stretch there as well. But my concern is more that he's a free agent at the end of the year because we don't know what he's going to do, where he's going to end up. I think that Jacksonville was a great offense to come into. There was no real target hog there. I know Kirk became that towards the end of the season, but I think that Ingram is a guy that benefited from that coaching staff as well. We've seen Doug Peterson with Zach Ertz for years feed tight ends the ball, and he did the same with Dallas Goedert. Well, they have both there, and I think that Ingram did benefit a lot from that coaching staff. If you can sell him now, I don't even know what I'd sell him for at this point. But looking at his ADPs going as tight end 8, I think that if you can get an early second for that.
Yeah, I would almost say if you can get any second. Yeah.
Second maybe, yeah. I think tight end is just such a wasteland right now. And if someone hasn't caught on to that contract situation, if you can get a mid to early second, I'd probably sell Ingram. The only thing I don't agree with your take on is you said that he came out of nowhere. He was the tight end 5 or 4, one of the two, in his rookie season. That's not nowhere. That's showing ceiling, and that's a big part of why I thought he was going to break out this year, or say break out, return to somewhat value. So yeah, that's the only part I disagree with. However, I do agree with everything else you said. It is a massive slider of what could happen in Evan Engram's career. Another guy I wanted to talk about, Nathan, I don't know whether this is one of the guys that you wanted to talk about, is Darren Waller. So I mentioned he only played 8 games. He ended as the tight end 30 across the entire season, or weeks 1 to 17, but still ended as tight end 9 in points per game for those games that he did play in. Biggest questions again, not surrounding his free agency, because he's not a free agent, but around the quarterback situation, because no one knows what the Raiders are going to do at quarterback. There's a lot of Tom Brady rumors. I'm not sure how true they are. There's a lot of Aaron Rodgers rumors at the moment. Again, I'm not sure how big they are. But what do you foresee for Waller? Because he's still got that upside, but I think it's kind of being slept on at the moment with where he ended up at the end of the season.
Yeah, look, I think the reality is they're either getting a slightly older veteran who you would still has elite game management, or you're getting a rookie who has the polar opposite with very little experience, where it's going to be a lot of controlled game script. And I think both of those schemes tend to actually fit a tight end well, because you've got someone like Brady, hypothetically speaking, or even a Rodgers who can pick out their passes. So Waller could sort of find this form, and if he's able to stay fit, especially with also to say with the rookie quarterback, I think he could become another important player, and I think he will tend to keep his value. I think they've done well. Foster Moreau also sort of clawed and took a lot of the snaps, and Foster Moreau was still productive without Waller. So I think that role in itself, with McDaniels, I think it has a role there. So I would tend to say Waller is a keep, if not, as you say, buy at discount with QB sort of uncertainty. And I do see him, if he stays fit. As you say, it's crazy to think he ended the tight end 9 and he played almost half a season. There's no ways to me he falls into sort of irrelevance. He will definitely be up there, tight end 6, possibly even pushing higher, I think. Depending on obviously who they draft and what the quarterback situation is. If they do get a bridge quarterback, that would be my only concern. If it's a really poor acquisition at quarterback, would be my only real worry.
I mean, he was tight end 9 in points per game, but I struggle with why he's currently going as tight end 10 in ADP for January. I think that it just comes down to perception. What have you done for me lately kind of situation with players, especially in Dynasty. One thing I will say with Waller is he's 30, so he will be going into the next season as 30. But bigger concern is his contract. So he did sign an extension during last season, I believe it was. But that extension after 2023, he can be cut for the minimum is 12 million or 11.5 million on the cap each of the 3 years following. So that's 24 to 26. I think that's quite scary in terms of the Raiders always like to give these type of deals out and be able to turn their offense around at any point. I mean, we saw it at the start of this season. Both myself and Rich, the former co-host of the show, were mentioning that everyone on the offense could be cut at the end of the season, and they could start afresh. Not that they would, but they could with the way that they were structured the contract. So he's an interesting one. Nathan, is there anyone else that you wanted to talk about from the top 12 by points of game, or do you want to move on to the next segment?
Yeah, I think we can. I think Njoku's maybe very briefly. Let's sort of just hit Njoku. I think Njoku's sort of has been hyped up for quite a while. And I think I'm trying to think when I first sort of half fell in love with him was I think one of the Hard Knock seasons where I sort of break out at the Browns when the Browns were really weak, and you just sort of liked his character, and I sort of always paid a close attention. And he had good weeks, and he struggled for consistency. He seemed to find a better rhythm when Watson sort of got into sort of his period at the end of the season, and I think he will be important there in Cleveland because I think they've obviously got Amari Cooper and Donovan Peoples-Jones, two quite big athletic receivers already. So I think Njoku will be a tight end that you can get at a discount. You're going to pick him up towards the end, sort of tight end 12, tight end 13. And I think that will be solid value for sort of a tight end streamer towards the end of the draft.
I mean, he had a stretch between weeks 3 and 7 where he was no worse than his tight end 17. He was the tight end 14 once during that stretch, and then all of that, the rest of that was tight end 6 and above. So he's got that upside. He was tight end 2 on the week in week 14, which is the first week he played with Deshaun Watson in live football. Again, he has that upside, but he also is a massive bust candidate every week. During the 3-week stretch where he did have Watson and they had those struggles with the offense, between weeks 15 and 17, he was tight end 26 at best. So he does have that upside. He also has the downside. So I think that with Watson taking a step forward next season, remember Deshaun Watson, we're talking about the player, not the person. We're going to ignore all of that personal side. But the player himself is going to take a step forward because he hasn't played for 2 years. So I definitely think that that's coming. And I think Njoku is going to be a guy that really steps up with that Deshaun Watson stepper. So let's look at the next segment, which is lining up outside. So this is outside the top 12. Wanted to try play on words there. I don't know whether you understood that. I don't know whether it made anyone laugh, but probably not, because I'm not that funny. So Kyle Pitts is the first one we spoke about. That is tight end 1 in August DLF ADP. He's still going as tight end 1, even though he didn't do very well this season when he did play. As I said earlier, don't think it was much of his fault, but we still are here with his value, maybe dropping a slight bit, but his rank has stayed the same. Where do you see Kyle Pitts going forward? Do you think that he's going to take a step next season?
Look, he's an athletic freak. He ticks all the boxes on paper. He ticks all the boxes on paper. He had a pretty good rookie year, although it was slow starting. I still need to see more of him as a red zone champion and someone who's getting more red zone targets in order for him to deserve being tight end 1 in Dynasty, in my opinion. I think he has the talent. I think he's good enough. So to me, it's the red zone opportunities, which again, he's had a whole season out now with sort of an injury or the majority of this last season. So next year and hopefully this off season, there'll be a bit more clarity in what's going to happen in Atlanta at quarterback, because that's the other big question mark is, are they going to run it with Ritter, which I almost assume that they will do. At the same time, there are a lot of handy free agent quarterbacks on the move this year, so we could well see a veteran possibly moving into that role, or at least the Falcons. We obviously know that, like the Saints, they were also in for Deshaun Watson when that whole saga was going on, so they weren't necessarily sold. That was before they got rid of Matt Ryan. Mariota's clearly out the front door, it seems. So I do think a lot will depend on Ritter, which again, to me, I don't think that justifies Kyle Pitts tight end 1. So to me, Kyle Pitts is a long-term play, and if you're really going young and you are really going sort of, I want to win my dynasty league in 2-3 years, fine, because I would like to think he gets there, but I just haven't seen enough of him actual production to say that why shouldn't I take TJ Hawkinson over Kyle Pitts right now?
Oh, that's spicy. I don't know whether the dynasty community is ready for that. Taking Hawkinson over Pitts, that's an interesting take. I personally don't agree, and that is just because I think Pitts has that upside of being elite like Kelsey. But as you said, it's going to be in a few years' time. I do think that you'll probably wait until the end of next season to see that jump, and that's it. But with that being said, he's still maintaining a good value here, and I'd be tempted to look at selling him based on what his current value is. Or maybe when you get into the season and he's actually scoring points, I think that would probably make more sense. But I still think you've still got a bit of exploring to do with Kyle Pitts. Now, I wanted to come to a guy, Nathan, that is on your Saints. He's a guy that kind of shocked a lot of people, if not everyone. It's Juwan Johnson. I know that Paul, one of the Dynasty writers for us, was talking all the way through the early off season, way through the early season to basically say, pick this guy up. He's going to do well. I don't think anyone really thought he'd do well for the entire season, but he did. He had a lot of touchdowns, but he was undrafted in August. I think that's quite the achievement to go from undrafted in Dynasty to relevant. He was tight end 10 in season finish across all 17 weeks and tight end 16 points per game. We always see this every few years or every year near enough that we see one or two undrafted tight ends become relevant in some way, shape, or form. I'm going to hand it over to you because it's your team. You know what you're talking about with this one. And I want you to have the monologue on this one. What do you see with Johnson next year?
Look, I was so pleased to see Juwan Johnson break out the way he did this year, and the Saints were desperate after we lost Michael Thomas, as we sort of spoke briefly early in the season. There and Landry was a very disappointing addition because he really didn't kick on, was very injury prone. The Saints were desperate, and I think the hype of Jameis Winston and we're going to be this gunslinging offense and go for broke. New coach as well, Dennis Allen. Look, he's obviously been in coaching before, but sort of head coach of the Saints. And there was a lot of upbeat that quickly fizzled out in the Saints. It was an incredibly disappointing season compared to what we've experienced the last 5, 6, 7 year period. Obviously, that the majority of that was during the Peyton and Breeze era, which is now the reality for Saints fans. And like myself, it's quite a worrying position to be in. We've got we have the biggest deficit in terms of cap space. We're about 50 million over the cap still. We don't have a franchise quarterback. We don't have a first round pick. We've got a head coach now who failed somewhere and is really struggling to sort of get the ball rolling in New Orleans. So I don't know, but the one of the silver linings along with the Olave is Juwan Johnson, and I think he had an incredibly good, important role to play in our offense because he became our leading sort of red zone receiver. And I think some of those touchdown catches that he pulled off were incredibly impressive for a guy. And I am optimistic that he can maintain that. My sort of devil's advocate to this argument, though, is that he only passed 50 yards in one game all season, 50 receiving yards. So from weeks 1 to 16, his best receiving yard game was the Falcons in week 15, where he had 67 receiving yards on 4 receptions. But apart from that, he did hit 40 consistently. He had 40 yards in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 games. So he clearly has shown that he's got a bit of a flaw. But I do worry that as soon as those touchdowns do dry up, and if they do dry up, if Michael Thomas is fit, maybe that's a big if. But if Michael Thomas is fit next year, or if the Saints go and have a fit Landry, or if Kamara sort of has a better year, then that position will become very quickly irrelevant again in New Orleans. But at the same time, I just want to appreciate what he did do this year, and I did think he was relevant. I would have huge concerns, even as a Saints fan. I'm not very high on him next year.
I mean, we mentioned pre-show when we were talking about him. that he is a restricted free agent going into next year. So the Saints will probably sign him to a very, very cheap deal. You don't have to pay restricted free agents much. So he'll probably be staying on the Saints, and you've got all of those questions that Nathan.
Yeah, that's if we can afford him.
That's if you can afford him. Yeah, I'd be worried if you can afford a random million for a guy like him. But let's move on to Greg Dulcich now. This is a guy that Rich, the previous co-host for 5 Yard Dynasty, was massively high on coming out of last year. He was my version of Jelani Woods. My tight end 2 was Jelani Woods. I'm not saying that either of us had him over Trey McBride as prospects, but we both had our tight end 2 loves, and his was Dulcich, mine was Jelani Woods. He was more right in terms of what they showed in their rookie year. He was tight end 26 in August ELF ADP, tight end 27 in season finish, and tight end 18 in points per game. He had that stretch where he was really good, and then he got injured, and there was a whole spiral. But the reason I put him on here is he had that good stretch with a bad offense. Like that offense just wasn't working for a good portion of this season. We had Russell Wilson not being brilliant. Nathaniel Hackett got fired. You've also got Cortland Sutton didn't look like his previous self when he was at his current peak. Jerry Jeudy started to get into rhythm at the end of the season, who's a massive buy for me at the moment. But Greg Dulcich is a guy that could really take off from Wilson's step up and that overall offense stepping up. My concern is his upside, and I think that I only see a Freiermuth style upside where he's going to be a consistent tight end 6 to 12 range on a season. I don't think he's ever going to be considered elite or even be thought of to be able to jump into that tier like a TJ Hawkinson was. I think that he's going to be another Pat Freiermuth at best, and at worst, I think that he's just going to hover around what he's doing now. Do you think that he can take a step up and become a Pat Freiermuth 2.0 essentially in terms of fantasy career? Where do you sit on him?
It's difficult. I have sort of my reservations, and I'm usually slightly pessimistic on sort of tight ends generally, especially the lower end or sort of mid to low tier tight ends. The reason why Dulcich is even on this list is because the whole preseason hype with Albert O, and I think everyone thought that Albert O was going to go to the moon. That's why when people saw Dulcich almost on the field for the first time, they're like, "Who is this guy?" But I agree with you. He took his opportunity and he carved a little bit of a role for himself in that offense. And again, I agree. The offense was weak. It was poor. Russell Wilson was nowhere near what we expected. And I can only hope that was the bottom of that offense, in the sense that offense can only improve from here. But there are 2 other mouths that they might need to feed again next year. And this is a fit Javonte Williams coming back, and also Tim Patrick. I'm not sure if Tim Patrick is a restricted or a free agent. It's something I might need to just double check. But I've always been a big fan of Tim Patrick as sort of a really late sleeping wide receiver. Maybe that's why this is a bit more of my narrative. But I do think that with Cortland Sutton, with Jerry Jeudy, with someone like a Patrick as a wide receiver 3, and then you've got Javonte Williams, I can't see, similar to what you said, I can't see elite production. Maybe a similar situation to Freiermuth, where there's a Najee Harris and there are 3 decent wide receivers. So yes, but again, I think the coach is going to be important, who sort of comes in. But I'm not over the moon about Dulcich. So I would probably say Pat Freiermuth 2.0 is maybe a fair reflection. If not, I still think he's a slightly lesser Pat Freiermuth.
Oh yes, he is at the moment, but I'm saying his upside is Pat Freiermuth on a consistent basis. I mean, when we look at the
absolute best, that's
where I'm going with that. I mean, he spent the first 5 weeks injured, didn't play a single snap, wasn't active for any of those games. And that's why when he came in week 6, we had already seen Albert O wasn't really showing anything. And then week 6 to 8, just before the bye, when he played, he was the tight end 5 in points per game over that time, or tight end 3 if you just look at those games. But there was obviously bye weeks during those games. That's why I'm looking at an average. But then when you look over the season, he obviously ended it by going on IR. You mentioned Tim Patrick. He's coming back. He is a Bronco confirmed. He will be under contract unless they want to take a massive dead cap hit to get rid of him and then have to replace him for more money than it would take to keep him on the roster. And the same with Cortland Sutton. They both got quite big cap hits, and they're not really cuttable unless the Broncos really want to get rid of them for whatever reason. So he's got to contend with those 3 options that are proven to be okay, if not good to great. That's me throwing Jerry Jeudy in there, as well as Javonte Williams when he comes back as well. So as I said, I'm not going to harp on much more about Greg Dulcich. Frymouth upside, that's the overall. Nathan, I've got Cole Kmet on here. I only wanted to bring him up because he is the new Adam Troutman in terms of. I know that sounds like I brought him up because he's a Saint. I promise you I didn't. However, in terms of in the off season, in a year 2 off season where they kind of showed a little bit as a rookie. I don't even think Adam Troutman showed that much, but they showed a little tiny bit as a rookie, a little bit of a glimmer. The Dynasty community hops onto them in their first off season as a veteran, and then they get wiped out in year 2 and they don't do much. I mean, that's a bit hard to commit. He did have that stretch, but it was a lot of touchdowns during that stretch. It wasn't like he was breaking the game.
Yeah.
He was the tight end 19 in points per game overall. He did end as the tight end 11 in season finish, which is interesting because I know a lot of people will probably just look at that season finish and won't really put together that there's a few guys that will jump up into that tight end, top 12 tight ends when you look at a points per game version of it. But I don't know whether a lot of people have really put together that Cole Kmet wasn't brilliant. Or as good as his season-long finish says. I think with those touchdowns, that's probably going to come down. I'm going to expect a little bit of a jump in his upside from a yardage point of view, because I don't know why I'm thinking this, but I have a feeling the Bears are going to trade the 101 and then try and put weapons around Justin Fields. Don't think they're going to draft a lot of defense, or when I say a lot, I mean primarily defense with a few random bits thrown in for offense. I think that it's going to be a very even draft. They're going to try and get a lot of picks because they traded a lot away. I'm still questioning the Chase Claypool trade, but that's another podcast. I'm not even going to talk about that right now. But I think that they're going to put a lot of weapons around Justin Fields. I think that's also going to help Cole Kmet, because when you look at who Justin Fields had to throw last year, it was Cole Kmet, it was Darnell Mooney for a small portion of the season. Equanimous St. Brown was their leading receiver for a good portion of the season as well. You had Velus Jones, who was a 3rd-round rookie that was 25 by the time he'd even taken a snap in the league, and still was kind of being pushed towards the punts and the kick returns, and yet still did something for them on offense. They just had nothing there. They even traded for N'Keal Harry for a conditional 7th, I think it was, that had one amazing catch, and that was it. I think they're going to put loads more around Justin Fields, and I think that's going to help.
Yeah, I do agree, and I hope for Fields' case they do that. And I think the one thing that I've just been thinking since, sort of speaking about Kmet, is the Bears to me are a team that sort of baffles me, because I feel they think they're one of the best 101 teams ever, in the sense that I didn't get much of a feeling that they were terribly upset with how their season was, and maybe they're not as vocal sort of on the social media bandwagon, but they had obviously that glimmer of hope with Fields and his running and his athletic ability, and I think they all sort of dove into that narrative throughout the season about the Bears and how we've got the best rushing quarterback under the sun. So there was a lot of positive hype for a team that ended up with the 101, and I think if you, as you said very clearly there, if you look at the receivers, there's nothing there. There's absolutely nothing there to talk about. So you've got a situation where everyone was sort of trying to piece things together and saying, well, how is this offense working? It either has to be Kmet or Fields because no one's catching passes here. So, and as you said, Kmet profited massively off that sort of 3-game span where he had 5 touchdowns in the middle of the season in 3 games. And I think that narrative just stuck with him throughout the season when it just fizzled out again. And I think I agree. Like Kmet, you hope he can only improve. He's shown that he can be a good red zone target, although it's only 3 weeks that he did that for. But the reality is that this Bears team has an incredibly big opportunity at the 101. And it's obviously incredibly difficult for a franchise to commit to a quarterback. But I do hope they stick the course with Justin Fields. I do like him as an athlete. Whether he can throw, other question marks. I sort of like to compare him a little bit to Jalen Hurts before Jalen Hurts became an MVP contender. Like Jalen Hurts is his improvement this year is unbelievable, and I don't think many other players and quarterbacks can have that sort of glow up in a season. So, look, let's hope Fields does improve, but I do 100% agree they need the weapons and they need offensive weapons, and you'd like to think that they will coincide with Kmet improving slightly. Kmet was seeing consistently at least 3 or 4 sort of targets, so there is a little bit of a flaw. But yeah, it's not worth breaking the bank for at all.
So the last guy I have on the list that I wanted to talk about is Mike Gesicki, and he's a free agent going into next year. I don't really know what to say about him. He had an awful season. He was being drafted as tight end 13. Ended as tight end 24 in season long, or tight end 36 as points per game. He was unusable for the most part of the season, and that's with an offense that had Tyreek Hill, that had Jalen Waddle, who were both top 5, top 10 wide receivers in any given week, and I think both ended in the season. In fact, I remember from last week, both ended in the top 12 wide receivers for points per game across the 17 weeks. So that offense really took a step forward in the passing game. It took away from Mike Gesicki, which is something that I didn't think would happen to this extent. I just didn't think this would happen at all, really. We saw Mike McDaniel get hired there, so we kind of thought maybe a Kittle kind of role will go in for Gesicki, but no, that didn't happen. Nothing happened for him. Where do you kind of see Mike Gesicki going into next year, Nathan? He's an interesting one. He could be an easy buy because he's a free agent.
Yeah, look, correct me if I'm wrong. I even think that the Dolphins used the franchise tag on him as well last season. Look, it's going to be interesting where he turns up. I was, this time last year when they franchise tagged him, I was always of the opinion, and this is probably going to crucify me if anyone actually picks this up or makes it go viral. But I always thought Gesicki would be a great sort of heir to the Kelsey throne. I always thought Gesicki was sort of that guy that had that elite upset, like that high. I thought he would be the perfect person to just slot into that Kansas team, and if Kelsey was to retire out of the blue, because I think he is one of the more explosive, offensive, attacking players. But clearly, look, we probably need a more in-depth Dolphins analyst almost to explain this to us. But the fact that, as you say, his points per game is so low, he was on the field a lot. He must have been doing an incredibly high blocking rate, and I think that's clearly what they got him doing. And maybe that is that's where your Tyreek Hill and your Waddles obviously reap the rewards. I would like to see, and I don't have it in front of me, how many routes he was running per game, and how much of the passing game he was involved in compared to whether or not he was in more of a blocking position, because that to me will be quite a big influence in my opinion. And I'll probably do this homework straight after this. But the reality is I've always liked Gesicki, and I do think he has a very high ceiling for a fantasy perspective. And I agree with you. The season was incredibly disappointing. I hope he ends up on an offense where they use him as primarily a pass catcher and sort of filter through, because I do think he can be that top tier tight end that people believe in. But yeah, unfortunately, he bombed so badly that I think they're going to be some seriously upset and bitter fantasy fans when it comes to Gesicki.
Yeah, so I'm looking at the stats now for him. What actually surprises me to start off with is he wasn't on the field as much as some people may think. So he was on the field less than Austin Hooper was. He was on the field less than Evan Ingram, Dalton Schultz, Hayden Hurst, even Jeff Swain of the Tennessee Titans was on the field more than him. He had 453 snaps, and all of those had above that, obviously. I think with Gesicki, we saw a lot more routes run from him while he was on the field. He just wasn't on the field as much. So looking at his routes run per game, that would be just under 20, so 19.4. So not a lot, but not indistinguishable. It was the 20th most routes in the season with 329 overall. So he did have a good opportunity, I'd say, or a mediocre opportunity. He just didn't produce. He only had 52 targets, sorry, so that was 29th in the NFL at the tight end. So
I think the only other way to sort of even half explain it is that he's got two of the most explosive wide receivers in the game on the same team as him. And I think for a quarterback like Tua, all he needed to do was find Tyreek Hill or find Waddle, and something would happen there. And even in the running game, when they sort of nestled into sort of Mostert and sort of Jeff Wilson, it was obviously quite explosive at the time there as well.
Yeah.
And I think, McDaniel quickly realized what worked for them and what didn't work for them. And unfortunately, Gesicki was obviously the piece of the offense that was redundant, because you've got two elite wide receivers who are performing at an incredibly high level. So, look, it was an incredibly disappointing season. I hope he sort of finds a team that can really sort of use him. I'd love to see him with a proper quarterback. I'm just trying to think. Even if he ends up on the Chargers with something like a Herbert, or ends up even in Cincinnati on a cheap deal with Burrow, but they've already got three incredible wide receivers, so it's sort of competing for targets. But I have been a Gesicki believer. I was disappointed, and I sort of hope he comes back.
Sounds like you still are. Yeah, you sound like you're pumping the table to go by him. Nathan, before we get out of here and I share the little brain teaser, do you have a dynasty tip for the listeners?
Sure. After the last 2-3 years sort of playing Dynasty, what I will say is, when in doubt, go wide receiver. Go wide receiver when in doubt. Don't hesitate. Just don't double think about that running back. Go wide receiver and build a long-term foundation.
There you go. So the brain teaser for this week, listeners, is in wide receiver rankings, where would Travis Kelce rank? And I'll let Nathan have a guess at that in a minute. So if Travis Kelce was a wide receiver, with the 2022 season just gone, where would he rank? We'll do both points per game and season long, because that's what I've done throughout the entirety of this series. I will point out I'm only using weeks 1 to 17 as usual, and they are different ranks. So it's not the same rank for both points per game and season long. Nathan, you can feel free to have a guess. I'm not going to tell you whether you get it right or not. Feel free to have a guess.
I would say season finish. I would say he would be wide receiver 4. Points per game, I would say he would be wide receiver 7.
Okay. Nathan, like everyone else, you're going to have to listen in next week to see whether you got it right. But until next week, guys, that's brilliant. Thanks, Nathan, for all your help this week. We'll see you next week. And remember, always just take the wide receiver. Just take the wide receiver. See you later, guys.
Cheers.